Liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from.
Good evening and welcome to the September 11, 2019 edition of Space News. This is Peter Aylward and I have Michael Abdullah and Angela DeGrazia here with me, and we're all from the Space Association of Australia. So let's get straight into it with some Australian space news. Australian small sat startup Fleet has raised $7.35 million in a new funding round. The company will use the funding to expand its constellation of small sats that provide the Internet of Things services. Fleet launched its first 4 satellites late last year. The company says demand for connectivity from its customers led to the new round, to enable it to launch a new set of satellites next year. The funding round was led by new investors Momenta Ventures and Horizons Ventures, along with some existing investors. And we'll just go over the ditch a little bit to New Zealand. Rocket Lab founder Peter Beck has been named an adjunct professor of aerospace engineering at the University of Auckland. Beck left school at the age of 17 to take an apprenticeship rather than go to university. We're not advising listeners to go that path. To quote Beck, being appointed an adjunct professor is incredibly humbling, but at the same time, I appreciate the irony, he said. And Rocket Lab has hired a former NASA engineer and manager who did go to university to handle its civil government launch services business. The company said Richard French was its new Director of Global Government Launch Services, responsible for working with NASA, NOAA and international space agencies. French worked for 12 years at JPL as an engineer and held management positions at JPL and NASA's Space Technology Mission Directorate, supporting the implementation of public-private partnerships. And over to Angelo.
Okay, thanks Peter. Let's go to the moon. Target moon anyway. NASA has updated a draft solicitation for commercial human lunar landers. The updated draft for the Human Landing System program maintains the overall approach from the original draft in July. That draft calls on NASA to procure landing services rather than the landers themselves from companies, but with some tweaks to its approach. NASA expects to award 4 base contracts in December for 9-month studies, with NASA then exercising options with up to 2 companies to proceed with lander development. The final solicitation should be early this US autumn. Okay, let's go further out than the moon to NASA Planetary. Members of the Mars InSight lander mission team are looking at new ways to get its heat flow probe moving into the surface again. The probe, or mole, was supposed to burrow as deep as 5 metres into the surface, but has been stuck just 30 centimetres deep because of a lack of friction with the surrounding soil. The principal investigator for the instrument said one option under consideration was to use the scoop on the end of the lander's robotic arm to press the mole against the side of the pit it had created to try to increase friction so that it can start moving again. Operations of InSight and other spacecraft at Mars are on hold through early September because of the solar conjunction that interrupts communications. NASA's Parker Solar Probe has completed its 3rd close approach to the Sun. The spacecraft came within an incredible 24 million kilometres of the Sun last week. You've got to remember Earth is about 150 million kilometres by comparison, so pretty good effort. Project officials said the spacecraft remained in good condition through the flyby. The spacecraft, launched a little more than a year ago, made 2 previous flybys at similar distances to the Sun, but in the future will come even closer. Boy. Let's talk about US military. US Air Force officials say they will work to allow a more open debate about the proposed Space Force. The announcement came amid criticism that it stifled advocates of the new service. A recent spate of reports and commentaries have claimed supporters of the Space Force in the US Air Force were given a gag order, and a 3-star general who openly supported the Space Force was effectively forced to retire. Current and former Air Force leadership denied there was a gag order, but said they were aware of the criticisms and were taking steps to ensure there was a more open debate about space. Little bit of a battle going on, and it reminds me of the famous line from the old movie Dr. Strangelove. You can't fight in here. This is a war room. There you go. All right. Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Angelo. And let's look at some European news. The European Space Agency moved an Earth science satellite to avoid a potential collision with a SpaceX Starlink satellite. ESA said its Aeolus satellite performed a manoeuvre last week to raise its orbit slightly, avoiding a close approach with a satellite identified as Starlink 44. The head of ESA's Space Safety Office said it decided to make the manoeuvre after data from the US Air Force showed a collision probability of at least 1 in 1,000. ESA said it was the first time it had to manoeuvre to avoid a satellite associated with a mega constellation, and is concerned such manoeuvres may become more frequent in the future as SpaceX and other companies deploy their systems. Further, the close encounter has heightened concerns about space sustainability. Even before the close approach, some in the space industry were raising the issue of how to operate large satellite fleets safely in space. OneWeb recently unveiled a concept called responsible space, outlining its view of how it will ensure safe space operations that it believes can serve as a model for others. SpaceX said last week it had decided not to move its Starlink satellite because initial predictions showed only a very low risk of a conjunction with ESA's Aeolus satellite. The company said it missed updates that increased the risk of a collision because a bug in our on-call paging system prevented the Starlink operator from seeing the follow-on correspondence on this probability increase. Well, that doesn't inspire much confidence, does it?
Not at all.
It does not. Maybe they need a decent communication satellite up there.
Indeed. And moving to Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin says he's open to taking foreign investment to fund development of the Vostochny Cosmodrome. Speaking at the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok last week, Putin said he was interested in outside investment for the facilities at the new launch site in Russia's Far East, stating that the facility was not built for military purposes. One launch pad is operational there and construction is underway on a second, but the project has suffered from corruption among companies hired to build the spaceport. And moving to India. India's second moon mission has hit a snag during its historic landing attempt. But Indian Space Agency ISRO hasn't yet given up hope of establishing contact with the lander Vikram. India would have become the fourth country after Russia, the US and China to soft land on the moon at the weekend. But minutes before the Chandrayaan-2 lander Vikram was expected to touch down on the lunar surface, ISRO lost communications with the lander. Scientists at the space agency have not given up hope on establishing contact with the lander yet, ISRO Chief K. Sivan said, adding that efforts would continue for the next 14 days. He blamed faulty execution in the last stage of the operation for the loss of communication. The last part of the operation was not executed in the right manner, he said. It was in that phase that we lost the link with the lander and could not establish contact subsequently. Meanwhile, ISRO says it is ready and willing to support Indian private ventures developing launch vehicles. The head of the Vikram Sabarai Space Centre told a recent meeting of entrepreneurs that the agency will not create any issues for you as companies propose development of their own launch vehicles. That includes providing ground control and tracking services for private launch vehicles, although ISRO's launch facilities are fully booked through to at least next year. And back to Angelo.
Okay, and let's go back to the United States and SpaceX. A US Federal Aviation Administration document outlines SpaceX's plans for Starship testing at its South Texas test site. The document revised an environmental assessment originally prepared for the Boca Chica site when SpaceX proposed to use it for Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy launches. SpaceX now plans to use it for its Starship vehicle, and the document found that doing so would have no significant new environmental impacts. The document also describes a three-phase approach for testing Starship, with the first phase of ground tests and very low altitude flights already complete. Meanwhile, a US federal court concluded last month that it doesn't have jurisdiction over a suit SpaceX filed about the Air Force's ongoing launch competition. Judge Lydia K. Grigsby of the US Court of Federal Claims said the court could not take up the suit about the launch service agreements the Air Force awarded last year to Blue Origin, Northrop Grumman and ULA. She said this was in large part because they were cooperative agreements that cannot be legally challenged like standard procurement contract awards. The judge said SpaceX could transfer its complaint to the US District Court for the Central District of California. Moving to Aerojet Rocketdyne. The CEO of one aerospace company, i.e. Aerojet Rocketdyne, says that she is mindful that ongoing civil and military space programs could be threatened by a change of administrations in the US. Speaking at a conference last week, CEO Eileen Drake said that while the industry hasn't seen such a focus on space as what's taking place today by the administration and Congress, a new president could change that, particularly in civil space programs. She said she was very conscious of similar transitions in the past, such as when the Obama administration decided to cancel the Constellation program that it had inherited. Drake said Aerojet was working with other companies to ensure such programs remain funded. Let's go over to Arianespace in Europe. Arianespace announced last week that its Vega small launch vehicle will return to flight in early 2020 after identifying the cause of a July launch failure. The company said that a thermostructural failure of the forward dome in the Zefiro 23 motor that serves as Vega's second stage caused the Vega to break apart on a July 10 launch. Arianespace provided few additional details on what caused that thermostructural failure. Avio, the company that manufactures the Vega, says it will take corrective measures to reduce significantly the risk of a similar failure in the future. That work will delay the next Vega mission to the first quarter of 2020 and also likely push back the introduction of the Vega C rocket. Okay, over to you, Pete.
All right, last couple of stories. Our new venture is seeking to support the development of a low-cost human settlement on the moon. The Open Lunar Foundation is a group that includes former NASA Ames Director Pete Worden, venture capitalist Steve Jurvetson, and former astronaut Chris Hadfield. The group has spent the last year and a half working on plans for a series of missions that could lead to a small lunar settlement for a cost estimate of $2 to $3 billion. The organisation has released few details about its plans and in a brief statement only said it advocates for using the moon to create positive futures in space and to improve life on Earth. Okay, finally this week, the team that captured the first image of a black hole has won a $3 million prize. The Breakthrough Prize Foundation awarded its prize in fundamental physics to the Event Horizon Telescope collaboration. which released earlier this year the first image of a supermassive black hole at the heart of galaxy M87. The image was collected by a network of radio telescopes around the world. And it doesn't look like anyone's going to be taking their retirement. The $3 million prize will be shared equally by the 347 scientists involved in the project for a little less than $8,650 per person. Well, it's better than nothing. And that's it for Space News this week. Thank you, gentlemen, and we'll be back with you again next week. Bye for now.